In the darkness between stars, where forgotten truths sleep beneath layers of time, there exists a tale the Jedi never wanted told. A story of prophecy and rebellion, of a three-eyed seer who dared to challenge the most sacred doctrine of the Sith themselves. Picture ancient temples wrapped in eternal storms, lightning illuminating ruins that have kept their secrets for 1,000 years, rain falling without end upon stones that remember when the galaxy trembled at a different kind of darkness. There was a mutant born, marked by the Force, 3 eyes instead of 2. The third eye saw what others could not, what others refused to see. He peered through time itself and witnessed a terrible truth. The rule of 2, the foundation laid by Darth Bane himself, was not the only path. Perhaps not even the right path. For this heresy, he was cast out, hunted by his own master, forced to flee into the forgotten corners of the galaxy, where even the Jedi feared to search. But what he built in exile would survive longer than empires. What he prophesied would echo through the ages, reaching even to the throne of Emperor Palpatine himself. On a world of perpetual darkness where the dark side itself warped reality, he became something the Sith had never seen before. Not a warrior, not a conqueror, a prophet. And his prophecies changed everything. Exploring the extraordinary story of Darth Millennial, a three-eyed heretic whose visions challenged everything, whose rebellion created a shadow religion that would endure for a millennium. His tale is one of courage, prophecy, and the dangerous price of seeing too clearly into the future. Now, here is something fascinating. About 62% of you watching right now have not yet subscribed. If you are enjoying these deep dives into Star Wars legends, I would genuinely appreciate your subscription. It truly helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these untold stories. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Every time I read your messages, I am amazed by how this community spans across continents and time zones. So go ahead and settle in. Dim those lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. Pull your blanket close, and let us begin this journey together into a corner of Star Wars history that has been waiting in shadow for far too long. Our story unfolds approximately 990 years before the Battle of Yavin, in an era when the galaxy believed the Sith had been utterly destroyed. The last great war between light and darkness had ended at Ruusan, where 1,000 Sith Lords had perished in a cataclysm of their own making. The Jedi celebrated. The Republic rejoiced. Peace, they believed, had finally come. They were wrong. In the deepest shadows, 2 figures moved unseen, a master and an apprentice. This was the rule of 2, the radical reformation created by the sole surviving Sith Lord, Darth Bane. He had watched his fellow Sith destroy themselves through endless infighting, through the hunger for power that turned every ally into an eventual enemy. So Bane had done the unthinkable. He had reduced the Sith to just 2 beings, one to embody the power of the dark side, one to crave it. The apprentice would grow strong, and when ready would strike down the master, each generation stronger than the last, patient, hidden, waiting for the day when the Sith would finally have their revenge. This was the sacred doctrine. This was the way. But what happens when prophecy sees beyond doctrine? Enter Darth Millennial. He was born different, born marked. Where others possessed 2 eyes to see the world, he possessed 3. The third eye, golden and terrible, sat centered upon his forehead like a curse and a gift intertwined. His pale skin seemed to glow faintly in darkness. His black and silver beard framed a face that inspired either reverence or revulsion, rarely anything between. When he looked at you with those three eyes, two blue and one burning yellow, you felt as though he could see not just into your soul, but into every possible future your soul might create. He was human, but mutation had marked him as something more or something less, depending on who you asked. His master was Darth Cognos, an Iktochi female known throughout the hidden Sith circles as the Huntress. She herself was gifted with precognition, able to glimpse fragments of what was to come. She had once been an assassin sent to capture Darth Bane himself, but upon meeting the Dark Lord, she had sensed that her destiny was somehow intertwined with his vision. She had begged to become his apprentice. When Darth Zana, Bane's student, had finally challenged her master for the title of Dark Lord, Cognos had stood aside and pledged herself to whoever emerged victorious. Zana had won that day, and Cognos had become the third Sith Master in the lineage of the Rule of Two. Now she trained Millennial, recognizing in his three-eyed mutation a prophetic gift even greater than her own. She taught him the ways of the dark side. She showed him how to bend the Force to his will, how to peer through the veils of time, how to become what the Sith called a shadow hand, a specialized role reserved for those with the rarest talents. But she could not teach him to unsee what his third eye revealed. And what it revealed would shatter everything. Darth Millennial did not arrive at the feet of Darth Cognos as a child seeking power. He came as someone already marked by forces beyond his understanding, already touched by visions that had made him an outcast among his own people. The details of his earliest years remain shrouded, lost to time, and deliberately obscured by the secrecy that surrounded all things Sith. What we know is this: he was born a mutant, a genetic anomaly that manifested in that terrible third eye. In a galaxy where appearance often determined destiny, where conformity meant survival, he was rejected. Cast aside, the very people who should have protected him turned away from what they could not understand. But the Force does not abandon those it marks. Somehow, through means that history has not clearly recorded, the young mutant found his way to the dark side. Perhaps he sought it out, drawn by visions that promised purpose where his birth had offered only rejection. Perhaps the dark side itself reached out to him, recognizing in that prophetic third eye a vessel for its will. The Force moves in mysterious ways, and the dark side has always had a particular hunger for those the light has abandoned. What matters is that Darth Cognos found him. Or perhaps he found her. The Huntress was not a master who accepted students lightly. She had served under Darth Zana, had witnessed the legendary duel where apprentice finally surpassed master, according to Bane's design. Cognos understood the Rule of Two, not as philosophy but as lived reality. She knew that every apprentice she trained would one day attempt to kill her. This was not betrayal. This was the way. The sacred cycle that ensured the Sith grew stronger with each passing generation. But when she looked upon the three-eyed mutant, when she felt the ripples in the Force that surrounded him like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon, she knew she had found something rare. Here was a being whose gift for prophecy might even eclipse her own. The third eye was not merely deformity, it was an organ of pure Force sensitivity. A window into futures that remained closed to those blessed with only two. She took him as her shadow hand, a specialized role within the Sith tradition reserved for those with unique abilities. Not every Sith was destined to become a Dark Lord. Some were assassins, others were scholars. The shadow hands were seers, advisors, those who could perceive threats before they materialized and opportunities before they ripened. Under her guidance, Millennial flourished. His training was brutal, as all Sith training must be. Pain became his teacher. Failure became his forge. Cognos pushed him beyond what seemed possible, forcing him to channel the dark side through every fiber of his being, until it responded to his will as naturally as breathing. She taught him to fight, to wield a lightsaber with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a storm. She showed him how to choke the life from an enemy without laying a hand upon them, how to shatter minds with fear, how to bend others to his purpose through manipulation so subtle they would believe every choice was their own. But more than anything, she trained him in the art of prophecy. Together they meditated in darkness, opening themselves to the currents of time that flowed through the Force like invisible rivers. Cognos showed him how to still his mind, how to separate truth from possibility, how to recognize the difference between what would be and what might be. The future, she taught him, was not a single path but a vast web of interconnecting possibilities. Every choice created branches. Every action rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen. For most Force users, these visions came as fragments, glimpses, shadows at the edge of consciousness. But Millennial's third eye gave him clarity that bordered on the supernatural. When he sank deep into the Force, when he let that golden eye open fully to the currents of time, he could see with terrible precision. He witnessed futures stretching decades ahead, centuries ahead. He saw the rise and fall of empires. He watched civilizations burn and rebuild. He perceived patterns that repeated across the ages, like echoes in an endless canyon. And slowly, inexorably, he began to see something that troubled him deeply. At first, he dismissed it. Surely his interpretations were flawed. Surely his master, with her greater experience and wisdom, would correct his misunderstandings. But the visions persisted. They grew stronger, more insistent, like a voice whispering truths he did not want to hear. In those prophetic trances, Millennial witnessed multiple futures for the Sith Order. In some, the rule of two succeeded brilliantly, producing Sith Lords of such devastating power that they brought the Jedi to their knees and conquered the galaxy entire. In others, the lineage was cut short by accident, by miscalculation, by the simple bad luck that plagued even the mightiest beings. Two Sith meant twice the vulnerability. If both died without an heir, everything Bane had built would collapse into nothing. But he saw other paths as well, alternative futures where the Sith existed in greater numbers, where knowledge was preserved across multiple lines, where competition bred innovation rather than extinction. These visions confused him. They contradicted everything Cognos taught, everything the rule of two represented. So he began to question, carefully at first, obliquely posing scenarios as intellectual exercises rather than challenges to doctrine. But Cognos was no fool. She sensed the doubt growing in her apprentice like a cancer. She responded with absolute certainty. Bane's way was the only way. The old Sith had destroyed themselves through their own greed and ambition. The rule of two channeled that hunger into refinement rather than chaos. It was perfect, unquestionable, sacred. Yet Millennial's third eye showed him truths his master could not see. The philosophical divide between them began as a hairline fracture, barely noticeable, but fractures given time and pressure become chasms. The years passed in shadow and secrecy, as they must for any Sith in an age when the galaxy believed their kind extinct. Cognos and Millennial moved like ghosts through the outer rim, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention, always training, always preparing for a war that might not come for generations. They trained on abandoned worlds where ancient ruins whispered of fallen civilizations, in deep space stations where no Republic patrol would venture, on moons so remote they lacked even names, only coordinates in forgotten star charts. Wherever they went, they left no trace. The rule of two demanded absolute secrecy. The Jedi could never know. Not yet, not until the Sith were ready to strike. During those years, Millennial became a weapon of extraordinary lethality. His lightsaber technique evolved into something uniquely his own, blending the aggressive forms Cognos taught him with innovations born from his prophetic gift. In combat, his third eye allowed him to perceive his opponent's intentions before they fully formed. He could see the attack coming 3 moves ahead, could position himself perfectly to counter strikes that had not yet been thrown. Facing him in battle was like fighting someone who had already won, who moved through the duel with the confidence of someone who had already watched it end in their favor. His command of the Force deepened beyond mere technique into something approaching art. He could reach across vast distances to touch the minds of others, planting suggestions so subtle they felt like one's own thoughts. He mastered the ability to drain the life essence from living things, to feed on their energy like a predator consuming prey. He learned to conjure lightning from his fingertips, to manipulate matter at the molecular level, to sense disturbances in the Force across entire star systems. But more than martial prowess, Cognos taught him the philosophy that supposedly justified everything they were and everything they would become. She explained to him the history of the Sith, reaching back thousands of years to when Dark Jedi first discovered the ancient Sith species and claimed their name as their own. She described the glory days of the Sith Empire, when Dark Lords ruled over vast territories and their power seemed limitless. She recounted the endless cycles of civil war, the betrayals, the poisonings, the apprentices who grew impatient and struck too soon, the masters who grew paranoid and eliminated potential threats before they fully developed. The Sith, for all their power, had been their own worst enemy. Then came the Brotherhood of Darkness, the final attempt to unite the Sith under a single banner. Lord Catan had led them, preaching a philosophy he called the rule by the strong, equality among Sith Lords. He claimed no single Dark Lord to create resentment, no hierarchy to inspire betrayal, just strong Sith working together toward a common goal, the destruction of the Jedi and the conquest of the Republic. It had been a beautiful dream. It had also been a catastrophic failure. At Ruusan, the Brotherhood had faced the Jedi Army of Light in a series of brutal campaigns. The fighting raged for years, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Finally, in desperation, Lord Khan had unleashed a thought bomb, a weapon of such terrible power that it consumed the life force of every Force-sensitive being within its radius. Jedi and Sith alike died screaming, their essences ripped from their bodies and trapped in a prison of pure Force energy. The Brotherhood of Darkness destroyed itself. But one Sith survived, Darth Bane. Cognos spoke his name with something approaching reverence. Bane had been a student at the Sith Academy on Korriban, a brilliant but iconoclastic thinker who believed the Brotherhood's egalitarian philosophy was actually weakness disguised as strength. He studied the ancient Sith texts, the writings of Dark Lords who had come before, and he reached a radical conclusion. The Sith did not need more numbers. They needed more quality. So Bane had manipulated events to ensure the Brotherhood destroyed itself at Ruusan while he remained safely distant. When the dust settled, when the Jedi believed they had finally won, he emerged from hiding and proclaimed a new order. The rule of two. One master to embody the power of the dark side. One apprentice to crave it. When the apprentice grew strong enough, they would challenge the master. If the master won, the apprentice was too weak and deserved death. If the apprentice won, they had proven themselves worthy to become the new master and take an apprentice of their own. Each generation would be stronger than the last. Each cycle would refine the Sith, like metal folded and refolded in a forge until it became unbreakable. The rule of two was not merely a structure, it was evolution weaponized. It was patience incarnate. It was the guarantee that when the Sith finally revealed themselves, when they finally struck at the heart of the Republic and the Jedi Order, they would be unstoppable. This was what Cognos taught Millennial with absolute conviction. This was the sacred doctrine he was expected to accept without question. But his third eye showed him complications. His master refused to acknowledge. He saw the brilliance in Bane's design. The rule of two did indeed produce powerful Sith. Each generation, refined through trial by combat, created individuals of devastating capability. The discipline it required, the patience it demanded. These were strengths the old Sith had lacked. Yet he also saw the fragility. What if the master died before training an apprentice? What if the apprentice died before surpassing the master? What if in a galaxy of trillions, the specific two Sith were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when opportunity arose? The rule of two placed all the Sith's eggs in one very small basket. It created efficiency, yes, but at the cost of redundancy. There was no margin for error, no backup plan, no alternative line should disaster strike. And Millennial's visions showed him disaster was always a possibility. More troubling still, he saw what the rule of two destroyed: knowledge. In the old days, the Sith maintained libraries, academies, holocrons shared among many practitioners. Dark side techniques were preserved and passed down through multiple lineages. But with only two Sith, what happened to knowledge the master did not teach? What happened to techniques the apprentice never learned? Each generation, something was lost. Maybe something small, maybe something vital. But over centuries, those losses would accumulate. The rule of two created strength through refinement, but it also created ignorance through elimination. He tried to explain these concerns to Cognos, gently at first, framing them as hypotheticals rather than criticisms. What if, he suggested, there was a way to maintain multiple Sith while still avoiding the chaos of the Brotherhood? What if the rule of two was not the only answer? Her response was immediate and absolute. No, there was no other way. Bane had seen the truth. The old Sith had proven through their own destruction that large numbers led only to infighting and failure. The rule of two was not merely one option among many. It was the only option, the final answer to a question that had plagued the Sith for millennia. To question it was heresy. But Millennial could not stop his third eye from seeing what it saw, and what it saw terrified him far more than his master's disapproval. It saw his own death at her hands, if he remained obedient. The prophetic gift that had once seemed like a blessing now felt increasingly like a curse. Every time Millennial sank into deep meditation, every time he opened himself fully to the currents of time flowing through the Force, that same vision returned with growing clarity and inevitability. He saw himself kneeling before Cognos. He saw her lightsaber igniting. He saw his own head rolling across cold stone while she stood above him, face expressionless, having eliminated an apprentice who had grown too powerful or too questioning or simply too inconvenient. This was the rule of two, in its purest form. The master maintained supremacy. The apprentice either surpassed them or died trying. There was no third option, no retirement, no peaceful parting of ways. If Millennial remained on this path, eventually Cognos would decide he had either learned enough to be a threat or questioned enough to be a liability. Either way, she would kill him. The rule of two demanded it. Unless he killed her first. But his visions showed him something else as well. Even if he defeated Cognos, even if he claimed the title of Dark Lord for himself and took his own apprentice, the cycle would simply repeat. His apprentice would eventually challenge him. Perhaps he would win that confrontation, perhaps not. Either way, the knowledge he carried, the unique insights his third eye provided, would be lost or diluted with each successive generation. The rule of two was a system designed to produce powerful individuals, but it was terrible at preserving wisdom. So Millennial began a secret study, one he carefully hid from his master. Late at night, when Cognos believed him asleep or meditating on his lessons, he accessed ancient Sith holocrons that had somehow survived from before Ruusan. These crystalline storage devices contained the wisdom of Dark Lords dead for centuries, their personalities and teachings preserved in matrix form. Bane himself had studied such holocrons, had learned from them, had then carefully destroyed most of them to ensure future Sith would have no alternative philosophies to distract them from the rule of two. But not all holocrons had been found. Not all knowledge had been eliminated. Millennial discovered texts describing the old Sith Empire, the true empire that had existed thousands of years before the Brotherhood of Darkness. He read accounts of Sith academies on Korriban and Zeost where dozens of apprentices trained simultaneously, where competition bred excellence without requiring execution. He found descriptions of the Sith hierarchy, the careful balance of power where many lords could coexist because roles were specialized and cooperation offered more advantage than constant betrayal. It had not been perfect. The old empire had eventually fallen, torn apart by internal conflict and Jedi crusades, but it had lasted for thousands of years. The rule of two was barely a generation old. Was it truly so superior, or merely different? Then Millennial discovered something that changed everything. Buried within one particularly ancient holocron, he found references to philosophers who had lived over 25,000 years in the past. Beings who had contemplated the nature of the Force long before the Jedi Order took its modern form, before the Sith became what they were. Two names appeared repeatedly in the fragments he could decipher. Claristes, Dark Ramis. Pre-Republic era thinkers whose writings had been controversial even in their own time. They had proposed radical ideas about balance, about the necessity of conflict, about how strength emerged not from domination but from competition between near equals. Their philosophy suggested that concentrating power in too few hands was as dangerous as dispersing it among too many. Reading their words, Millennial felt something click into place within his mind. What if Bane had been partially right? What if Lord Khan had also been partially right? What if the truth lay somewhere between the Brotherhood's chaos and the rule of two's rigidity? Lord Khan had called his philosophy the rule by the strong. Not rule by the many, but rule by those proven through competition to be worthy. Multiple Sith Lords, yes, but Sith who had earned their place through demonstrated power and vision. Not a brotherhood of equals, because equals did not exist in nature, but a hierarchy based on merit rather than mere survival of whoever happened to be the last two standing. The more Millennial contemplated this synthesis, the more his third eye showed him futures where such a system might work. He saw Sith who specialized in prophecy, preserving knowledge for future generations. He saw Sith who excelled at combat, protecting the Order's interests. He saw Sith who mastered manipulation, infiltrating governments, all working toward a common goal, competing to prove their excellence, but not required to kill each other simply because doctrine demanded it. It would require safeguards, structures to prevent the chaos that had destroyed the old empire and the Brotherhood. But it could work. His visions showed him it could work. The problem was Cognos. His master would never accept such ideas. She had drunk too deeply from the well of Bane's philosophy. To her, the rule of two was not merely correct, it was sacred. Divinely ordained by the dark side itself. To suggest alternatives was not intellectual curiosity, it was blasphemy. Millennial tried once more to broach the subject, carefully framing his questions to avoid direct challenge. They were meditating together in the ruins of an ancient Sith temple on a world whose name had been forgotten even by those who had once worshipped there. The dark side was strong in that place, feeding their power, amplifying their connection to the Force. In such moments, barriers between master and apprentice sometimes lowered. Truths could be spoken that would be dangerous in normal circumstances. Millennial posed his question as gently as possible. What if Bane's system was not the final answer, but simply the best answer he could conceive given the circumstances of his time? What if future Sith, having seen the rule of two in practice, might refine it further? Cognos opened her eyes. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. She asked him if he understood what he was suggesting. If he grasped the enormity of questioning the foundation upon which the modern Sith were built. Bane had saved their order from extinction. His wisdom had given them a path forward when all seemed lost. To doubt him was to doubt everything. Millennial tried to explain. He spoke of his visions, of the fragility he perceived, of the knowledge being lost with each passing generation. He described what he had learned from Plaristus and Dak Remis, from the records of the old Sith Empire, from Lord Khan's rule by the strong. Cognos listened in silence. Then she told him the discussion was over. The rule of two was absolute, final, not subject to debate or revision. If he continued down this path of doubt, if he allowed these heretical thoughts to take root in his mind, he would become useless as an apprentice. And useless apprentices did not live long. The threat was clear: conform or die. But Millennial's third eye had already shown him what conforming would bring. A future where his unique gifts were wasted, where the knowledge he had accumulated was lost, where prophecy itself became just another tool serving a system too rigid to adapt. He could no longer unsee what he had seen. That night, alone with his thoughts and his visions, Darth Millennial made a decision that would echo across the centuries. He would not kill his master. He was not ready for that confrontation, and his visions suggested he might not survive it, even if he tried. But neither would he submit to a philosophy that his every instinct and prophetic gift told him was incomplete. There was a third option, one that no apprentice in the rule of two had ever considered. He would leave. He would take his heretical ideas and his prophetic visions, and he would go somewhere Cognos could not follow. Somewhere so hidden, so forgotten, that even the greatest Sith prophetess would not think to search for him there. His third eye opened fully, golden light spilling across the darkness of his quarters, and he looked into the web of possible futures stretching before him. And there, in one specific branch of that vast tree of possibility, he saw it. A world wrapped in eternal storms, ancient temples sleeping in endless rain, a place where the dark side itself had sunk so deeply into the soil and stone that reality bent around it. A world whose very name whispered of secrets and shadow. Drummond Kaz. There are moments in history when a single decision splits reality into two diverging paths, when what was becomes what might have been, and what will be emerges from the fracture like something born from violence. For Darth Millennial and Darth Cognos, that moment arrived on a moonless night in a forgotten temple at the edge of known space. The confrontation had been building for months, ever since that meditation session where Millennial had dared voice his doubts. The relationship between master and apprentice had grown increasingly strained. Cognos watched him constantly now, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She monitored his movements, questioned his studies, tested him with scenarios designed to reveal the depth of his heresy. And heresy it was. By the standards of the rule of two, Bane's doctrine was not meant to be questioned. It was meant to be obeyed, internalized, accepted as the fundamental truth upon which all Sith existence rested. But Millennial could not make himself believe what his visions contradicted. The final break came suddenly, though both had felt it approaching like a storm gathering strength over days of oppressive heat. They were training in lightsaber combat, as they did most days. The routine was familiar. Cognos would attack with measured aggression, and Millennial would defend while she critiqued his form, his footwork, his anticipation. It was supposed to be instructional, not adversarial. But on this day Cognos struck with real intent to harm. Millennial's third eye saw it coming just in time. He parried the blow that would have taken his head, twisted away from the follow-up strike aimed at his heart. His master's face was calm, almost serene, as she pressed the attack with lethal precision. He realized with cold clarity that she had decided, whether now or later, she intended to eliminate him. The heretic apprentice who questioned the sacred doctrine, better to cut out the cancer before it spread. So he did something no apprentice in the rule of two had done before. He ran. Not in fear, though fear was certainly present, but in calculation. His prophetic gift showed him the next 10 seconds of combat with terrible clarity. If he stayed and fought, Cognos would kill him. She was simply more experienced, more powerful, more perfectly aligned with the dark side's ruthless efficiency. He might injure her, he might even survive for a few minutes, but he would not win. The rule of two offered only two options when master and apprentice came to this point: fight and surpass, or fight and die. Millennial chose a third way: survival through strategic retreat. His lightsaber flashed in a pattern Cognos recognized as defensive, buying him the split second he needed to disengage. He reached out with the Force, not to attack but to create chaos. Stone fragments from the ancient temple walls exploded inward. Dust and debris filled the air. In that moment of obscured vision, he turned and fled toward the hangar where his ship waited. Behind him, he felt Cognos's rage in the Force like a physical blow against his back. She came after him with the speed and precision that had earned her the title of Huntress. Her footsteps echoed through corridors that had not heard such pursuit in millennia. Her lightsaber hummed with promise of violence. Her presence in the Force was a hunting predator closing on wounded prey. But Millennial's third eye showed him each turn before he reached it, each obstacle before she deployed it, each attack before she launched it. He moved through the temple like someone retracing steps memorized from dreams because in a sense he had. His prophetic gift mapped the next 30 seconds constantly, updating with each decision, each possibility branching and rebranching in the infinite complexity of potential futures. He reached the hangar. His Sith infiltrator sat waiting, its dark hull seeming to absorb the dim light. The boarding ramp was still down from his earlier maintenance work. Pure fortune, or perhaps the Force itself, had arranged circumstances to allow this escape. Cognos burst into the hangar as he reached the ramp. They faced each other across 50 meters of open space. Both lightsabers ignited, both combatants ready for the confrontation that doctrine demanded. But instead of charging forward to his death, Millennial spoke. He told her that he could no longer follow the rule of two, that his visions had shown him its limitations, its fragility, its gradual erosion of knowledge. He described what he had learned from the ancient philosophers Plaristes and Dak Ramis, their wisdom from over 25,000 years in the past. He explained how Lord Kain's rule by the strong, properly refined and implemented, could create a Sith order that preserved knowledge while maintaining strength through competition. Multiple Sith Lords, he argued, did not have to mean chaos. It could mean specialization, redundancy, preservation of techniques that would otherwise be lost when a master died before teaching them, or an apprentice died before learning them. Cognos listened to every word. Then she called him a heretic, a traitor to Darth Bane's vision, a fool who had allowed ancient texts and prophetic delusions to corrupt his understanding of what the Sith required to survive. She told him that Bane had witnessed firsthand what happened when multiple Sith Lords coexisted: betrayal, backstabbing, civil war that had nearly destroyed them entirely. The rule of two was not a suggestion. It was the only way forward, the only path that ensured each generation grew stronger rather than merely more numerous. And if Millennial could not accept this fundamental truth, then he was worthless as an apprentice. She raised her lightsaber and began walking toward him with lethal purpose. Millennial made his choice. He turned and ran up the boarding ramp. The ship's engines were already warming from his earlier preparations. Some part of him, perhaps guided by precognition, had known this moment was coming and had made arrangements. The ramp sealed. The engines roared to life. Blaster fire from Cognos's attempts to disable the vessel sparked against the hull, but failed to penetrate. Then he was lifting off, accelerating through the hangar's atmospheric shield, racing toward the safety of space, while his master stood below, her rage echoing through the Force like a scream that transcended sound. Darth Millennial had done the unthinkable. He had rejected the rule of two. He had refused to kill his master, or die trying. He had abandoned the Sith Order at the moment when it should have refined itself through their confrontation. He was heretic, coward, traitor to everything Bane had built. But he was also alive, and he was free. As his ship's hyperdrive engaged and the stars stretched into lines around him, Millennial allowed himself one moment of trembling relief. His hands shook on the controls. His breathing came in ragged gasps. The reality of what he had just done, the enormity of the bridge he had burned, crashed over him like a wave. Cognus would hunt him. The rule of two demanded it. A theoretical apprentice could not be allowed to survive, to spread his corruption, to create alternatives to Bane's sacred doctrine. She would search every world, follow every lead, use every prophetic tool at her disposal to find him. He needed somewhere to hide, somewhere so remote, so forgotten, that even the greatest Sith prophetess would not think to search there. Millennial closed his normal eyes and opened the third. Golden light filled his consciousness as he sank into the deepest prophetic trance of his life. He looked through time and space, searching the Force for the one place in the galaxy that could shelter a Sith heretic. A place where the dark side itself ran so deep that it would mask his presence, where ancient secrets slept beneath layers of forgetting. And there, in the vast web of possible futures and forgotten pasts, he found it. A world that had once been the beating heart of the Sith Empire thousands of years ago. A planet abandoned when that empire fell, its location lost to all but a handful of beings who still remembered the old ways. A place where the dark side had soaked into the very soil, where storms raged eternal, where reality itself bent under the weight of accumulated shadow. The name came to him like a whisper across centuries. Drummond Caius. In the depths of hyperspace, surrounded by the otherworldly tunnel of faster-than-light travel, Millennial researched his destination with the focus of someone whose life depended on making no mistakes. Because his life did depend on it. The ancient texts he had secretly copied onto his ship's data stores contained fragmentary references to Drummond Casa. Most were thousands of years old, recorded when the planet had still served as the capital of the reconstituted Sith Empire. That empire, which had nothing to do with the recent Brotherhood of Darkness, had been a true galactic power. It had controlled vast territories, commanded armies of millions, built monuments that dwarfed anything the modern republic could conceive. But like all empires, it had fallen. The exact circumstances of its dissolution remained murky, lost to the historical chaos that surrounded the collapse of great civilizations. What was clear was that by approximately 2,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Sith Empire had simply ceased to exist. Its territories had been reclaimed by the Republic. Its people had scattered or been absorbed into other cultures. Its capital world had been abandoned. Drummond Kaz had become a ghost. The planet's location had been deliberately hidden, deleted from Republic and Jedi archives. This was not unique. The galaxy contained thousands of lost worlds, planets that had once been inhabited, but whose coordinates had been misplaced or destroyed over the millennia. Space was incomprehensibly vast. Even with hyperspace travel, even with sophisticated navigation systems, it was entirely possible for a planet to simply vanish from galactic awareness. But some beings had retained the knowledge. According to the texts Millennial studied, Lord Khan himself, the founder of the Brotherhood of Darkness, had known Drummond Kaz's location. Khan had been a scholar as well as a warrior, obsessed with Sith history and eager to reclaim the glory of ages past. He had discovered the coordinates in some ancient archive and had actually led forces there during the New Sith Wars. In 1004 years before the Battle of Yavin, During what historians called the Light and Darkness War, the Brotherhood of Darkness had attempted to establish a presence on Dromund Kaas. They had landed armies, occupied the ancient temples, tried to tap into the dark side power that still saturated the world. The Republic had responded with a violent counterattack. The battle that followed had been brief but brutal, ending with Brotherhood forces driven off the planet. After that, the chaos of the continuing war had apparently caused even Kayan to abandon interest in the remote world. He had larger concerns, more immediate battles to fight. Then came Ruusan, the thought bomb, the end of the Brotherhood, the beginning of the rule of two. And Dromund Kaas had once again faded from memory. As far as Millennial could determine from his research, only a handful of beings in the entire galaxy knew the planet's location now. Kayan was dead. Most of his inner circle had perished at Ruusan. The Jedi had never known where Dromund Kaas lay, and their archives still listed it as myth rather than reality. The Republic's official position was that if the planet had ever existed, it was so thoroughly lost that searching for it would be pointless. Perfect. A world the Jedi did not believe in. A world the Republic had forgotten. A world where the dark side itself would mask his presence from prophetic searches. Even Cognos, with all her skill at foresight, would struggle to pierce the veil of dark energy that surrounded Dromund Kaas. It was like trying to see a shadow against darkness, a whisper beneath a roar. If anywhere in the galaxy could hide a heretical Sith Lord, it was there. But the journey gave Millennial time to contemplate what he was truly doing, the magnitude of his choice, the future he was abandoning, and the one he was embracing. He would never be a Dark Lord of the Sith, not in the traditional sense. That title belonged to those who followed the rule of two, who claimed it through ritual combat, who embodied Bane's vision by fleeing rather than fighting. Millennial had forfeited his place in that lineage. Cognos would take a new apprentice. That apprentice would eventually challenge her. The cycle would continue without him. In that sense, the rule of two had already replaced him. He was irrelevant to its future. But perhaps he could create a different future. His third eye showed him possibilities that both thrilled and terrified. He saw himself not as a Dark Lord, but as something else, something older. A prophet in the truest sense. Someone who saw what others could not see, who preserved what others would forget, who taught truths that doctrine tried to erase. He would build something on Dromund Kaas. Not a rival order to challenge the rule of two directly, because that would be suicide. Not a brotherhood attempting to recreate Kayan's failed vision. Something new, a synthesis of ancient philosophy and modern understanding, a place where knowledge could be preserved, where prophecy could be practiced, where the dark side could be explored without the constant threat of being murdered by your master or apprentice. He would call it the Dark Force, after the planet's inherent nature and the power that had guided him there. And he would be its prophet, its founder, its first guardian of forgotten truths. The vision crystallized in his mind with such clarity that he wondered if it came from his own imagination or from the Force itself, guiding him toward a destiny larger than any individual ambition. Perhaps there was no difference. As his ship hurtled through hyperspace toward a world that had not seen visitors in decades, Millennial felt the weight of his old identity falling away like a shed skin. He was no longer the three-eyed apprentice desperately seeking his master's approval, no longer the heretic fleeing judgment, no longer the student questioning doctrine from a position of weakness. He was becoming something new, a prophet of the dark side, a founder of mysteries, a guardian of truths, too dangerous for the narrow confines of the rule of two. The ship's navigation system chimed, indicating approach to the destination coordinates. Millennial opened all three of his eyes and prepared for emergence from hyperspace. His prophetic gift showed him fragments of what awaited, storm clouds that never cleared, rain that never ceased, lightning illuminating ruins older than the Republic itself, a darkness so deep it had become almost holy. He was ready. The stars snapped back into focus around him. The swirling blue tunnel of hyperspace collapsed into the black reality of normal space, and there, filling his viewport like a vision made manifest, hung Dromund, the world of eternal storms, his new home, his sanctuary, his temple. The first thing that struck Millennial about Dromund was not what he saw but what he felt. The dark side was everywhere, not as a presence or a force or even an overwhelming power, but as a fundamental aspect of reality itself. It was the air, it was the ground. It was woven into the fabric of existence so thoroughly that separating the planet from the dark side would be like trying to separate water from wetness. The moment his ship entered the upper atmosphere, instruments began malfunctioning. His navigation systems flickered and died. Communication arrays sparked and went silent. Even the basic sensor packages that should have been showing him atmospheric composition and weather patterns displayed only static and nonsense readings. For a moment, panic touched him. If his engines failed, if the ship lost power entirely, he would plummet into those storm clouds and die in a crash that no one would ever discover. But the engines held. Whatever dark side phenomenon interfered with technology on this world, it apparently had limits. Or perhaps the dark side simply did not care about an engine's function, only about the sophisticated detection and communication gear that might reveal the planet's secrets to distant observers. Below him, the storm clouds roiled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Lightning arced between cloud banks with such frequency that the entire sky appeared to strobe in rhythm, as though the planet itself had a heartbeat measured in electrical discharge. Thunder rolled continuously, a bass rumble that penetrated even the ship's hull. And rain. Endless, torrential, violent rain that fell, not in drops but in sheets, transforming the atmosphere into something between air and ocean. Millennial guided his ship lower, breaking through the cloud layer into the weird twilight that passed for daylight on Dromund. The storm clouds were so thick, so omnipresent, that actual sunlight rarely penetrated to the surface. Instead, the world existed in a perpetual gloom, lit only by the constant lightning that turned everything into stark shadows and brief illumination. The first view of the surface took his breath away. Swamp stretched to the horizon in every direction. What had once been jungle, according to the historical texts, had devolved over centuries into vast quagmires of brackish water, twisted vegetation, and treacherous mud. Islands of firmer ground rose here and there, covered in plants that had adapted to the constant moisture and darkness. Everything grew in strange, distorted ways, as though the flora itself had been corrupted by the dark side saturation. But the swamps were not empty of civilization's remnants. Ruins rose from the murk, like the bones of some impossibly vast corpse. Massive structures that had once been temples, citadels, academies, monuments to Sith power and glory. Most were in various states of collapse, worn by time and weather into haunting shells of their former magnificence. But even ruined, even half submerged in swamp water, they radiated an aura of terrible grandeur. This had been the capital of an empire, the center of a galactic power that had rivaled the Republic itself. Now it was a graveyard, populated only by whatever animals had adapted to its toxic atmosphere and whatever ghosts lingered from ages past. Millennial guided his ship toward the largest structure he could see, a temple complex that rose from the center of a particularly deep quagmire. Even from a distance, he could feel its power. This was no ordinary ruin. This was a nexus, a focal point where the dark side concentrated with such intensity that reality itself became malleable. The Dark Force Temple. It must have been magnificent once. The structure rose in tiers, each level marked by massive columns and elaborate carvings depicting scenes of conquest and dark rituals. The highest tower stretched toward the storm clouds like an accusing finger pointed at absent gods. Lightning struck that tower with such regularity that scorch marks covered its surface, yet the structure had endured for thousands of years. According to the texts, this temple had been a battleground during the Light and Darkness War. Lord Kain's forces had occupied it briefly before being driven off by Republic troops. That meant the interior might be damaged, might be dangerous, might be inhabited by things best left undisturbed. But it also meant that no one had claimed it in the decades since. It was available, waiting, ready for someone bold or desperate enough to make it their own. Millennial was both. He set his ship down on what appeared to be a landing platform near the temple's base. The structure was ancient, cracked and overgrown, but it held his vessel's weight. As he powered down the systems that still functioned, he felt the planet's presence pressing against his consciousness like a living thing examining an intruder. Then he opened the boarding ramp and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical blow. Within seconds he was soaked through, his robes clinging to his body, water streaming down his face and into his eyes. The temperature was warm, almost tropical, but the constant moisture made everything feel clammy and oppressive. The air itself seemed thick, harder to breathe than normal atmosphere. And the force. Oh, the force was overwhelming here. Every breath brought dark side energy into his lungs. Every step sent it flowing up through his feet. The planet did not merely contain the dark side. It was the dark side given physical form, concentrated and aged like some terrible wine that had been fermenting for millennia. Millennial opened his third eye fully, allowing his prophetic gift to perceive what normal vision could not. The world transformed around him. He saw the layers of history pressed into the stone, the echoes of rituals performed here thousands of years ago, the ghosts of Sith Lords who had walked these paths when the Empire still thrived. He saw the battle that had raged here during the war, blaster fire and lightsabers flashing in the darkness, bodies falling into the swamp never to be recovered. But more than the past, he saw the future. His vision expanded, showing him the years ahead. He saw himself claiming this temple, repairing its most damaged sections, establishing chambers for meditation and training. He saw others joining him, Force sensitives drawn by visions and rumors, naive cultists seeking forbidden knowledge, failed Jedi looking for a different path. He saw them filling the temple's halls, learning the arts of prophecy, becoming what they would call prophets of the dark side. He saw his cult growing, surviving, enduring for centuries after his own death. He saw his teachings passed down through generations until they reached someone who would change the galaxy. He saw a future where his supposed failure became triumph, measured not in decades but in millennia. The vision faded, leaving him standing alone in the rain, looking up at the temple that would become his home. Lightning struck the highest tower, illuminating the entire structure for one brilliant moment. In that flash, Millennial saw what perhaps only his third eye could have perceived. The temple was not merely a building, it was a focusing lens for dark side energy, drawing power from the planet itself and concentrating it in that tower, in the highest chambers where the Sith Lords who built this place had performed their most sacred and terrible rituals. That was where he would establish his sanctum. That was where he would write his prophecies. That was where he would train others to see what the Force tried to hide. The Dark Force Temple had found its new master, and Darth Millennial, heretic and prophet, had found his destiny. He walked toward the entrance, rain streaming from his robes, lightning painting the world in stark shadows around him, thunder providing a drum cadence for his approach. The massive doors hung open, broken from the battle decades ago, revealing darkness within, the kind of darkness that had depth and weight and presence. Millennial smiled with all three eyes and stepped inside. Behind him the storm raged on. It would rage for centuries, For millennia, until long after every living being who remembered this moment had turned to dust, the storms of Drummond Cadiz were eternal as the dark side itself. And in that eternal storm, a heretic began building something that would outlast orthodoxy. The first weeks on Drummond Cadiz were spent in exploration and survival. Millennial moved through the Dark Force Temple like an archaeologist uncovering layers of forgotten history. Each chamber told a story. Each hall whispered secrets. The damage from the battle 30 years prior was extensive but not catastrophic. Blaster scorches marked the walls where Republic soldiers had fought Brotherhood warriors. Collapsed sections blocked some corridors entirely. But the bones of the structure remained sound, and more importantly, the nexus of dark side energy in the highest tower remained untouched. That tower became his first priority. He cleared debris from the spiral staircase that wound upward through the temple's heart. Each step took him higher, and with each level, the dark side grew more concentrated. By the time he reached the uppermost chamber, the air itself seemed to hum with power. This had been a meditation sanctum for Sith Lords thousands of years dead, and their presence lingered like perfume in an abandoned room. The chamber was circular, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with windows that looked out over the endless swamp. Lightning struck so close that the thunder felt like it originated inside his chest. Rain lashed against the ancient transperistil, creating patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. This was where he would write, where he would prophesy, where he would build the philosophical foundation for everything that would follow. But philosophy required followers, and followers required a reason to come. Millennial spent months in solitary contemplation, meditating on exactly what he intended to create. He was not trying to replace the rule of two. That would be futile. Cognos and her eventual successors would continue Bane's lineage whether he existed or not. He could not challenge them directly, could not compete with their focused, refined approach to power. What he could do was preserve what they would lose. He began by studying the texts he had brought with him. The works of Claristes and Dacrymis occupied him for weeks. These philosophers had lived over 25,000 years in the past, in the pre-Republic era, when the Force itself was understood differently. They had written about balance, not as the Jedi conceived it, but as a natural state of competition between opposing forces. Conflict, they argued, was not something to be eliminated, but something to be harnessed. Strength emerged not from domination, but from constant testing against worthy opposition. Their ideas resonated with something Lord Catharn had attempted with his Brotherhood of Darkness. Catharn had called his philosophy the rule by the strong, not rule by the many, which led to weakness through dilution, but rule by those who proved themselves through competition and excellence. Multiple Sith Lords could coexist if they understood that their competition made them stronger rather than weaker. The problem with Khan's implementation had been structure. He had tried to create equality among Sith Lords, which was contrary to the nature of the dark side itself. The dark side did not believe in equality. It believed in hierarchy based on power. Strength commanded, weakness obeyed. This was not cruelty, but simply the fundamental operating principle of reality as the dark side understood it. So Millennial began synthesizing these ancient philosophies with his own prophetic insights, creating something that had never existed before. A dark side tradition that acknowledged the rule of two's validity while offering an alternative path for those who did not fit its rigid constraints. He would not call his followers Sith, because that title belonged to Bane's lineage. Instead, he would create something older and perhaps more honest. The Dark Force. Named for this world, for the power that saturated every stone and stream, for the fundamental nature of the energy they would study and channel. Not evil, though the Jedi would call it that. Not destructive, though destruction would sometimes be necessary. Simply the other half of existence that the galaxy tried so desperately to deny. and he would be its prophet, the supreme prophet of the dark side. This was not arrogance, but acceptance of his nature. His third eye gave him sight others lacked. He saw futures stretching decades ahead, centuries ahead. He perceived patterns in the Force that remained invisible to those blessed or cursed with only two eyes. If that did not make him a prophet, nothing could. With his philosophy crystallized, Millennial began the delicate work of attracting followers. He could not advertise, could not send messages through normal channels. The Jedi monitored communications. Republic intelligence agencies watched for any hint of dark side activity, and Cognos would certainly be searching, using her own prophetic abilities to track her heretical apprentice. So he reached out through the Force itself. Late at night, when the storms reached their peak intensity and lightning struck the tower in rapid succession, he would sink into deep meditation and send subtle ripples through the dark side. Not messages but impressions, not words but feelings, the sensation of being called, of being needed, of belonging to something greater than oneself. He sent these whispers to those who would be receptive, failed Jedi who had tasted the dark side and found it more honest than the light. Force sensitives born into circumstances where the Jedi would never find them. Beings who had been rejected or cast out or simply never fit into the galaxy's comfortable categories. People like himself, in other words. Mutants and outcasts and those who saw truths others preferred to ignore. And slowly, impossibly, they began to arrive. The first was a human woman from the Outer Rim who had dreamed of Drummond Kaas for 3 consecutive nights before stealing a ship and following the vision to its source. The second was a Zabrak male whose Force sensitivity had manifested late in life, too late for Jedi training, but not too late for darker instruction. The third was a former Jedi Padawan who had been expelled from the Order for asking too many questions about the nature of the Force and whether the Jedi's interpretation was the only valid one. They came alone or in pairs, scattered across months and years, each bringing their own reasons and their own desperate hunger for something the galaxy had denied them. Millennial tested each one, not through combat, though he assessed their ability to defend themselves, not through displays of raw power, though he measured their connection to the Force. He tested them through prophecy. He would look at them with all 3 eyes and ask them to tell him what they saw when they looked at the future. Most saw nothing. Some saw fragments. A rare few saw enough to be worth training. Those who passed, he welcomed into the Dark Force Temple. Those who failed, he sent away with their memories altered so they could not reveal this place to others. It was mercy of a sort. They were not executed for their inadequacy, merely made to forget they had ever found this world. But those who remained became the foundation of something that would endure for over 1,000 years. He taught them the philosophy he had synthesized from Plaristes, Dak Ramis, and Lord Khan's rule by the strong. Multiple practitioners of the dark side could coexist without destroying each other if they understood that competition refined rather than eliminated. They would vie for his favor, for positions of authority within the growing cult, for the right to be called his most promising student. But they would not murder each other at the first opportunity, because doing so would weaken the collective knowledge they were building. This was not the Jedi's cooperation through harmony. It was cooperation through calculated self-interest. Each individual grew stronger by having access to teachings and techniques that would be lost in the rule of two's narrow master-apprentice chain. The cult as a whole grew stronger by preserving multiple perspectives and approaches. He trained them in the arts of prophecy and foresight above all else. This would be their defining characteristic, their unique contribution to the dark side's endless exploration. They would be seers, oracles, beings who looked into the murky waters of potential futures and interpreted what they saw for those wise enough to listen. Every student, regardless of their other abilities, spent hours each day in meditation focused on developing precognitive abilities. They learned to still their minds, to open themselves to the currents of time, to distinguish between true visions and mere imagination. Millennial taught them the techniques Cognos had taught him, refined through his own unique perspective, how to follow probability threads into the future, how to recognize nexus points where small actions could create large consequences, how to see not just what would happen, but what might happen given different choices. The Dark Force Temple slowly transformed from abandoned ruins into a functioning academy of sorts. Not like the Sith Academy that had once existed on Korriban training warriors for an empire. This was smaller, more focused, more specialized. They were not trying to conquer the galaxy. They were trying to understand it at levels others could not perceive. But Millennial was not naive about what he was building. He understood that any organization claiming truth would eventually encounter those who disagreed, and he made a decision that would haunt the Dark Force's legacy for centuries. Anyone who did not believe in their teachings, who rejected the validity of their prophecies, who questioned the fundamental premise of what they were attempting, was labeled a heretic. The irony was not lost on him. He had been called heretic by Cognos for questioning the rule of two. Now he proclaimed heretics those who questioned his own vision, but he justified it through pragmatism. They were few in number, vulnerable to discovery, dependent on absolute loyalty to survive. Dissent was not merely philosophical disagreement, it was existential threat. So heretics were not tolerated. They were eliminated. The cult developed practices around this principle. Informants who reported doubters, trials where the accused had to prove their faith through demonstrations of prophetic ability, executions carried out in the swamp, bodies fed to whatever creatures lurked in the murk. It was brutal. It was hypocritical. It was also, from Millennial's perspective, necessary for survival. The other critical aspect of the Dark Force was secrecy. They attempted to keep their existence hidden from the wider galaxy. Communications with the outside were minimal and carefully monitored. Followers who left the temple for supplies or missions did so under strict instructions to never reveal where they had been or what they had learned. The location of Drummond Casas remained a closely guarded secret, known only to those initiated into the cult's inner circles. This secrecy served multiple purposes. It protected them from the Jedi, who would certainly try to eliminate any dark side organization they discovered. It protected them from the rule of two Sith, who might see them as rivals or threats. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed them to develop their arts without external interference or pressure. Over the years, the cult grew. Not rapidly, but steadily. By the time Millennial had been on Drummond Chaos for a decade, approximately 20 individuals called the Dark Force Temple home. By 2 decades, that number had doubled. They came from dozens of worlds representing multiple species, united only by their force sensitivity and their hunger for the knowledge Millennial offered. He established a hierarchy based on prophetic ability. Those who saw furthest and clearest rose in rank. Those who struggled remained students. At the top sat Millennial himself, the supreme prophet, the three-eyed seer whose gift had started everything. They called themselves prophets of the dark side, though in those early years the name was informal rather than official. They made prophecies constantly, recording their visions in journals and holocrons for future reference. Most predictions were small, personal, relevant only to cult business, but occasionally someone would see something significant, a natural disaster on a distant world, a political assassination that would reshape a sector, the birth of a force-sensitive child who might one day become significant. They were building a library of the future, one vision at a time. And Millennial, watching his followers grow in skill and confidence, felt something he had not experienced since leaving Cognos: purpose. He was no longer a student serving someone else's vision. He was a founder creating something genuinely new. Whether it would survive beyond his lifetime remained unknown. Whether it would achieve anything of lasting significance was equally uncertain. But it existed, against all odds, against the certainty of both Jedi and Sith that only their ways were valid. The dark force had taken root in the eternal storms of Dromund Kaas. And that, for now, was enough. Years became decades. The young heretic who had fled his master's wrath aged into something approaching wisdom. Millennial's beard grew longer, shot through with more silver than black. His pale skin developed lines that marked the passage of time and the weight of visions that grew heavier with each passing year. But his 3 eyes remained as sharp as ever, the third one golden and terrible, still piercing through the veils of time to see what others could not. His greatest work during these years was not training followers or maintaining the temple, important as those tasks were. His greatest work was prophecy itself. Millennial possessed a gift that appeared perhaps once in 1,000 generations. His third eye was not merely an organ of sight, but a lens through which the Force itself focused temporal energy. When he sank into his deepest trances, when he opened himself fully to the currents of future possibility, he saw with a clarity that terrified even him. He saw the rise and fall of governments centuries before they would occur. He witnessed the births of beings who would reshape the galaxy decades after his own death. He perceived patterns in galactic history, cycles that repeated with variations across millennia, wars that echoed earlier wars, empires that mirrored fallen empires, the endless dance of light and dark rising and falling like tides governed by invisible moons. And he began recording what he saw. The prophecies he wrote during his time on Dromund Kaas would become legendary among those few who knew they existed. He composed them in ancient Sith language, partly to preserve tradition and partly to ensure only the properly educated could interpret them. The texts were dense, complex, layered with meaning that revealed itself differently depending on when they were read. Some prophecies were specific to the point of being disturbing. He foresaw the construction of 2 massive battle stations, spherical weapons capable of destroying entire planets. He saw their locations. He perceived the precise moments of their destruction, down to the coordinates where rebel forces would strike their vulnerable points. These visions came to him decades before the technology to build such weapons would even exist, yet the details were exact. Other prophecies were broader, speaking to the nature of power itself. He wrote of the eternal conflict between those who sought to impose order through control and those who sought to achieve freedom through chaos. He described how this conflict would never end because it reflected something fundamental about sentient consciousness itself. Order and chaos, light and dark, Jedi and Sith. The names would change, but the war would continue until the last conscious being in the galaxy drew their final breath. He prophesied the rise of a galactic empire. Though he did not name it as such, he saw a republic transformed into something darker, more authoritarian, ruled by a single individual whose power would eclipse anything seen in millennia. He perceived that this emperor would be a Sith Lord, the culmination of Bane's rule of 2. Proof that the doctrine worked exactly as designed. This vision troubled him deeply. It suggested that Cognos had been right, that the rule of 2 would eventually produce a Sith so powerful they could conquer the galaxy, that Bane's patience and discipline would be vindicated, that his own rebellion, his alternative philosophy, his entire life's work might be nothing more than a footnote to a story whose ending was already written. But he also saw something else. Something that gave him hope or perhaps merely justification for his choices. He saw his own cult surviving, enduring, being rediscovered by that future emperor and integrated into the new order. The prophets of the dark side would serve the very system he had rejected, but in doing so they would preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. They would become advisors, teachers, keepers of techniques, the rule of two's narrow focus would have eliminated. Both paths were necessary. Both served the dark side's ultimate purpose. Bain's way created power. Millennial's way preserved wisdom. The galaxy, it seemed, needed both. He wrote this insight into one of his most important prophecies, though he encoded it heavily. Future readers would have to work to extract its meaning. But for those willing to make the effort, the message was clear. Orthodoxy and heresy were not opposites but complements. Each defined the other. Each made the other possible. Training his followers in the prophetic arts became increasingly important. As the years progressed, Millennial knew his own death would come eventually. Prophecy had its limits, and he could not clearly see his own end. Whether that blindness was inherent to the gift, or simply a mercy the Force provided, he did not know. But he understood that the dark force would need to continue without him. So he poured everything he knew into his students. He taught them the meditation techniques Cognos had taught him, refined through decades of practice. How to quiet the conscious mind while allowing the subconscious to open fully to the Force. How to distinguish between genuine visions and fears or hopes masquerading as prophecy. How to follow probability threads without becoming lost in the infinite branches of possibility. Some students excelled beyond his expectations. They developed their own techniques, their own approaches to foresight. This pleased him. He was not trying to create copies of himself, but rather to establish a tradition that would evolve and adapt after he was gone. The cult grew slowly but steadily. By his 30th year on Documentaries, perhaps 50 individuals called themselves prophets of the dark side. By his 50th year, that number had doubled. They were never numerous compared to the Jedi or even the ancient Sith academies, but they were dedicated, skilled, and absolutely loyal to the vision Millennial had created. They inhabited the highest tower of the Dark Force Temple, almost exclusively now. That nexus of dark side energy had become their sanctuary, their meditation hall, their library. The power that concentrated there amplified their prophetic abilities, allowing them to see further and clearer than they could elsewhere. Some of the prophecies that emerged from those sessions were remarkable in their accuracy and detail. They predicted natural disasters on worlds they had never visited. They foresaw political upheavals in governments they knew nothing about. They perceived the deaths of significant individuals years before those deaths occurred. When their predictions proved accurate, it reinforced their faith in what they were doing. When predictions failed, they analyzed why, studying the decision points where possibility had branched differently than expected. Prophecy, they learned, was not about certainty, but about probability. The future was not fixed. Every choice created new branches, new possibilities, new potential outcomes. A skilled prophet could see the most likely paths, but nothing was guaranteed. Free will existed, even if it operated within constraints imposed by circumstance and character. This understanding separated them from simpler fortune tellers or frauds who claimed absolute knowledge of what would come. The prophets of the dark side were honest about the limitations of their gift, at least among themselves. To outsiders, they might claim greater certainty to enhance their mystique, but internally, they understood that prophecy was art as much as science, interpretation as much as observation. Yet despite their growing skill, despite the knowledge they accumulated, despite the prophecies they recorded and preserved, the Dark Force never achieved galactic significance during Millennial's lifetime. They remained hidden on Documentaries, isolated from the wider galaxy, unknown to the vast majority of beings. Their prophecies went unheard by those who might have acted on them. Their wisdom sat in holocrons and journals that no one outside the cult would ever read. They had created something remarkable, but only they knew it existed. This reality weighed on Millennial as he aged. Had he made the right choice? Would it have been better to stay with Cognos, to challenge her when he was ready, to claim the title of Dark Lord and continue Bane's lineage? The rule of two Sith were growing stronger, exactly as designed. Somewhere in the galaxy, hidden as carefully as Millennial himself, Cognos or her successor was training the next generation. That lineage would eventually produce the Emperor he had foreseen, the being who would rule the galaxy. What would the Dark Force produce? Prophets who advised no one, seers whose visions changed nothing. Knowledge preserved but never applied. On his darker days, Millennial wondered if his entire life had been an elaborate exercise in futility, a rebellion against orthodoxy that accomplished nothing except creating a small cult that would die with him, or shortly after. Perhaps Cognos had been right. Perhaps the rule of two was the only way. Perhaps his visions had shown him possibilities but not probabilities, futures that could exist but never would. But then he would meditate, opening his third eye fully to the currents of time, and he would see further. He would perceive the long view, the centuries beyond his own death. He would watch as the prophets of the dark side endured, survived, adapted. He would witness their eventual discovery and integration into galactic events. He would see his teachings, diluted perhaps but recognizable, influencing beings he would never meet. And he would understand that success was not always measured in lifetimes. Sometimes it was measured in millennia. So he continued teaching, continued prophesying, continued building something that might not matter in his time, but could matter tremendously in times yet to come. He poured his knowledge into his students like water into vessels that would carry it forward after the spring had run dry. In his final decades, Millennial became less a teacher and more a living icon. Younger prophets, who had never known another life, revered him as the founder, the first seer, the being whose gift had started everything. They called him the Supreme Prophet, not as a title he claimed, but as a description of what he was. His 3 eyes had become legendary among them. His prophecies were studied with the intensity scholars reserved for sacred texts. He had become, without quite intending to, the center of a religion. This amused and troubled him in equal measure. He had never wanted worship, had never claimed divine inspiration beyond what his connection to the Force provided. But he understood that humans and other species needed symbols, needed figures to embody the ideals they aspired to. If he had become that figure for the Dark Force, so be it. Better that than being forgotten entirely. As his body weakened with age, as his movements grew slower, and his meditation sessions shorter, Millennial spent more time recording his final thoughts and instructions. He created holocrons that contained not just his prophecies but his philosophy, his methodology, his understanding of why the Dark Force existed, and what purpose it served. These would be his legacy, his gift to generations he would never meet. And when death finally came for him, as it came for all beings regardless of their power or wisdom, he faced it with the strange peace of someone who had seen it approaching for years. His prophetic gift had shown him this moment in fragments, though never clearly enough to know precisely when or how. He died in the highest tower of the Dark Force Temple, surrounded by his students, with lightning illuminating the eternal storms outside, and rain drumming against ancient transparisteel. His last words, according to those present, were about the future, about what they would become, about the role they would play in events he could see, but they could not yet imagine. Then his 3 eyes closed for the final time, and the Supreme Prophet passed into whatever waited beyond life. But the Dark Force did not die with him. The years after Millennial's death were uncertain ones for the prophets of the dark side. They had lost their founder, their most gifted seer, the living embodiment of everything they represented. Some feared the cult would collapse without his guidance. Others worried that they would fracture into competing factions, each claiming to be the true inheritors of his legacy. Neither happened. Instead, the prophets surprised themselves with their resilience. Millennial had taught them well. He had established structures and traditions strong enough to survive his absence. More importantly, he had instilled in them the understanding that prophecy was bigger than any individual, even him. The ability to see through time, to perceive the patterns underlying apparent chaos, to glimpse futures waiting to be born, this gift belonged to the Force itself. They were merely vessels through which it flowed. So they mourned their founder with appropriate ceremony, then returned to the work he had taught them. The cult evolved naturally over the generations that followed. Students became teachers. Teachers became elders. New seekers continued to arrive on Drummond Caius, drawn by the same subtle Force whispers that had attracted the first followers. The temple that Millennial had reclaimed from ruins became a true academy, its halls filled with beings dedicated to understanding time's mysteries. They called themselves the Prophets of the Dark Side, officially now, abandoning the more informal name of the Dark Force that Millennial had used. It was a small change, but it reflected their evolution from a personality cult centered on one being into a genuine tradition that could stand independently. Their practices remained focused on prophecy and foresight above all else. Every prophet, regardless of their other abilities, spent hours each day in meditation aimed at developing precognitive skills. They recorded their visions meticulously, creating an ever-growing library of predictions about events near and far, significant and trivial. Over decades and centuries, patterns emerged from this accumulated data. They learned to recognize which types of visions were most reliable, which meditation techniques produced the clearest results, which external factors enhanced or inhibited prophetic ability. The highest tower of the Dark Force Temple remained their primary sanctuary. The nexus of dark side energy that Millennial had claimed continued to amplify their abilities. Some prophets spent weeks at a time in those chambers, emerging only when physical needs absolutely demanded. They reported visions of extraordinary clarity and scope during these extended sessions, though the mental strain was considerable. But despite their growing expertise, despite the knowledge they accumulated, despite their dedication to perfecting the prophetic arts, the prophets never achieved galactic significance. They remained hidden on Drummond Caius, unknown to the wider galaxy. The planet's location was still lost to official records, deleted from Jedi archives, forgotten by the Republic. Only whispers of the Dark Force were spoken in the wider galaxy, rumors exchanged among dark side cultists and conspiracy theorists who believed in things respectable people dismissed as fantasy. The prophets preferred it this way. Secrecy was survival. Anonymity was protection. If the Jedi discovered them, the Order would dispatch knights to eliminate what they would perceive as a dark side threat. If Republic authorities learned of their existence, military forces would be sent to occupy or destroy the temple. Better to remain myth than to become target. So they endured in isolation, generation after generation, century after century. Their numbers never grew large, perhaps 100 individuals at most across the entire cult's existence during this period. They lived frugally, sustained by supplies brought in by members who ventured out to nearby systems when necessary. Some prophets spent their entire lives on Drummond Caius, never seeing another world, never walking beneath a sun that was not filtered through eternal storm clouds. It was a strange existence, suspended between past and future, anchored in a present that seemed to move in slow motion compared to the galaxy beyond their hidden world. Meanwhile, in that wider galaxy, the lineage of the Rule of Two continued exactly as Darth Bane had designed. Cognos had eventually taken a new apprentice after Millennial's desertion. That apprentice had challenged her when ready. The cycle had repeated, each generation refining and strengthening the Sith through ritualized conflict. Master trained apprentice. Apprentice eventually surpassed master. The new master took a new apprentice, over and over, across centuries, with patience and discipline that would have been impossible for the old Sith to maintain. And it worked. By every measurable standard, The rule of two produced results far superior to what Millennial had created. The Sith lineage grew stronger with each generation, accumulating power and knowledge in a focused, deliberate manner. They infiltrated galactic institutions, they manipulated political systems, they positioned themselves to eventually seize control of the Republic itself and transform it into the Empire Millennial had foreseen. The prophets, by contrast, remained in their temple recording visions that no one would act upon. They preserved knowledge that no one would access. They trained skills that affected nothing beyond their own small circle. In the grand calculus of galactic history, the rule of two was succeeding, while the alternative path Millennial had championed was languishing in obscurity. This was the uncomfortable truth the prophets had to confront. Their founder had been wrong about the fundamental question, or if not wrong, then at least unable to prove himself right within any meaningful time frame. The rule of two was not just theory, it was demonstrably effective practice. The proof was in the results. Yet the prophets endured anyway, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of faith that Millennials' visions of their eventual significance would prove accurate, perhaps simply because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. The galaxy beyond Drummond Kaas had no place for beings like them, Force sensitives who rejected both Jedi orthodoxy and Sith doctrine in favor of a third path that satisfied neither. In 100 years before the Battle of Yavin, a group of prophets established a settlement on Kalakar 6, a moon orbiting Drummond Kaas in the same system. The temple was becoming crowded, and some wanted space to develop their own interpretations of Millennial's teachings. The moon offered that opportunity while keeping them close to the Nexus world that amplified their abilities. This expansion was modest but significant. It suggested the cult was not merely surviving but growing, adapting, establishing roots that might weather whatever storms the future brought. The prophets on Kalakar 6 developed slightly different practices than those who remained in the original temple. They focused more on practical applications of prophecy, trying to use their visions to anticipate and prepare for threats. They experimented with combining foresight with other dark side techniques, creating hybrid approaches that Millennial had never explicitly taught. This divergence caused some tension within the cult. Traditionalists argue that the founders' methods should be preserved exactly. Innovators countered that Millennial himself had been a heretic who questioned orthodoxy, so remaining static would betray his spirit. The debate never became violent, but it simmered beneath the surface of cult politics for decades. Meanwhile, the practices that had disturbed Millennial in his final years continued and even intensified. The labeling of dissenters as heretics, the trials where accused individuals had to prove their loyalty, the executions in the swamp. Over generations these evolved from desperate survival measures into accepted traditions. The prophets had become what they once opposed, rigid, unquestioning, intolerant of alternatives to their own vision. They had forgotten, or chosen to ignore, that Millennial himself had been cast out as heretic before founding their order, that his great innovation had been questioning absolute truths others took for granted. This is what happens to movements over time. The revolutionary becomes the establishment. The heretic becomes the enforcer of orthodoxy. The rebels' descendants defend the status quo their founder fought against. It is perhaps the oldest pattern in history, repeating endlessly across cultures and eras. But through all these changes, through all the decades and centuries, through the gradual drift away from Millennial's original vision, one core element remained constant: the prophecies themselves. The prophets continued to see, continued to record, continued to preserve visions of futures that might come to pass. Their library grew with each generation, thousands of predictions stored in holocrons and journals. Most would prove inaccurate or irrelevant. Some would be eerily precise. A few would be genuinely significant, though no one outside the cult would know it. They foresaw the Clone Wars decades before the first clone was grown. They predicted the rise of specific individuals who would become significant military and political figures. They glimpsed the construction of massive fleets and the movements of armies across the galaxy. All recorded, all preserved, all locked away in a temple on a world no one could find. Knowledge without application, wisdom without influence, prophecy without purpose. Or so it seemed, because hidden within the visions the prophets recorded was one prediction that would change everything, one future that kept appearing across multiple seers and multiple generations with remarkable consistency. They saw a time when Drummond chaos would be rediscovered, when an individual of immense power would find them, when the prophets of the dark side would finally step out of isolation and onto the galactic stage. They did not know when this would happen. They could not identify who would find them, but they saw it with sufficient clarity to believe it would occur. So they waited and watched and prepared. The question that haunted the more thoughtful prophets was whether this future emergence would be triumph or tragedy. Would they finally achieve the significance Millennial had promised? Would they prove that his alternative path had value? Would they demonstrate that preserving knowledge across multiple practitioners served purposes the rule of two could not? Or would they simply be absorbed into someone else's vision, their independence eliminated, their teachings twisted to serve purposes they had never intended? The answer lay in the future, and despite all their prophetic gifts, despite centuries of practicing foresight, despite Millennial's extraordinary third eye that had started everything, they could not see clearly enough to know which destiny awaited them. So they did what beings always do when faced with an uncertain future. They continued living, continued practicing their arts, continued believing that what they did mattered, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. In the eternal storms of Drummond chaos, in the highest tower of the Dark Force Temple, the prophets meditated on time and possibility. Rain fell without ceasing, lightning illuminated their visions, thunder provided rhythm to their breathing. And somewhere in the wider galaxy, unseen and unknown to them, the pieces were moving into position for the moment when isolation would end and prophecy would finally meet reality. The galaxy turned, years became decades, decades became centuries, and somewhere in the endless dance of political intrigue and hidden manipulation, a being of extraordinary power was searching. Darth Sidious was his name, though the galaxy knew him as Senator Palpatine of Naboo. He was brilliant, patient, utterly ruthless, and obsessed with uncovering every fragment of dark side knowledge that existed. The rule of two had produced in him exactly what Darth Bane had envisioned, a Sith Lord so refined, so powerful, so perfectly attuned to the dark side, that he could orchestrate the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Order simultaneously, while everyone who should have stopped him remained blind. He was the culmination of 1,000 years of careful breeding, training, and refinement, the proof that Bane had been right. And he was looking for Drummond chaos. Palpatine had discovered references to the lost world in ancient texts, the same texts that had guided Millennial centuries earlier. He learned of the prophets of the dark side through whispers and rumors exchanged among fringe Force cults. Most dismissed these stories as fantasy, myths about seers who could predict the future with perfect accuracy. But Palpatine understood that myths often contained kernels of truth, and truth was power waiting to be claimed. So he searched, and eventually, sometime before the year 22 before the Battle of Yavin, he found it. The moment Palpatine's ship emerged from hyperspace above Drummond Cassie, the prophets felt his presence like a shockwave through the Force. Here was power on a scale they had never personally encountered. Here was a being who embodied everything the rule of two had promised to create. Here was the future they had seen in fragments and visions for generations finally arriving in flesh and terrible purpose. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to fight, but the eldest among them, Those who had studied Millennial's writings most carefully recognized what was happening. The prophecies were being fulfilled. Palpatine did not come as conqueror, though he certainly could have destroyed them if he wished. He came as someone who recognized potential usefulness. The prophets possessed skills he valued, their ability to peer through time, to anticipate threats and opportunities, to provide counsel based on genuine foresight rather than mere political calculation. These were assets worth acquiring rather than eliminating. He made them an offer: join him, serve his vision. In exchange, they would finally step out of obscurity and onto the galactic stage. They would have resources, protection, purpose. Their prophecies would matter, would be heard by those in positions to act upon them. After centuries of isolation, they could finally prove their worth. It was everything they had waited for, and everything they should have feared. The prophets debated among themselves. Some argued this was exactly what Millennial had foreseen. His visions had shown their cult serving a great empire, preserving knowledge, influencing galactic events. Others pointed out the irony. They were being asked to serve the rule of two, the very system their founder had rejected. They would become tools of the orthodoxy he had called incomplete. But in the end, pragmatism won. Palpatine was offering them survival and significance. Refusing meant eventual discovery by less friendly forces and probable elimination. The choice was not really a choice at all. So the prophets of the dark side bent their knee to Darth Sidious and became part of his growing network of dark side operatives. Palpatine was delighted with what he had found. He appointed Kadan, the most skilled prophet, as supreme prophet of the dark side, giving him authority over the entire cult. He designated them the Emperor's mages and integrated them into what he called the secret order of the Empire. He moved some prophets off Drummond Cassis to Imperial Center, where they could advise him directly. Others remained on the hidden world, continuing their studies and training. And he began sending his other dark side followers to Drummond Cassis for training. The temple that Millennial had reclaimed from ruins became a proving ground for Palpatine's agents. Inquisitors studying how to hunt Jedi, dark Jedi learning techniques the rule of two had never emphasized. Military officers with force sensitivity being trained in battle meditation and tactical prescience, all of them exposed to the Prophet's teachings, all of them benefiting from the knowledge that centuries of isolation had preserved. Among those who trained on Drummond Cassis was Jarek, an inquisitor who would later become infamous for his obsession with power. It was here that he first heard the legend of the Valley of the Jedi from a prophet named Chronal. That story would haunt him for decades, eventually leading to events that would unfold years after the Empire's fall. Grand Admiral Neil Declan trained there as well, learning to use the Force to telepathically meld the units under his command into superior fighting forces. His graduation exercise involved using the Force to kill a captured rebel, proving his commitment to the dark side and his worthiness to return to the fleet. The Dark Warrior Azrakal studied under the prophets, becoming so powerful that Supreme Prophet Kadan secretly trained him as a weapon to use against Palpatine and Vader if the Sith ever turned on the cult. Azrakal's hatred for Kadan eventually led him to desert, but his training demonstrated the caliber of instruction the prophets could provide. Even Marek Stael, a talented pilot who became one of Palpatine's hands, received his Force training from the prophets on Drummond Cassis. He remained loyal to the cult even after achieving the rank of Emperor's Hand, possibly the only one to maintain such dual allegiance. The prophets had finally achieved relevance. Their teachings were shaping Imperial agents. Their prophecies were informing Imperial strategy. Their knowledge was being applied in ways that affected galactic events. But at what cost? They served the rule of two now. Everything Millennial had built as an alternative to Bane's system was now subordinate to a Sith Lord who embodied that system's ultimate success. The irony was almost unbearable. The heretics' followers had become servants of orthodoxy. The rebels had been absorbed into the empire they had implicitly rejected. During the Clone Wars, the prophets proved their value dramatically. When separatist forces led by the dark side assassin Asajj Ventress attacked Dromund Kaas, the prophets provided intelligence that helped Republic forces resist. Ventress herself encountered the prophets, later recording her impressions in her personal journals. She called them reclusive and strange, described their prophecies as delivered in sing-song voices, but acknowledged that their gift of future sight was genuine and had proven useful during the battle. The predictions the prophets made during this era were remarkable. They supposedly foresaw the precise time and place of the destruction of both Death Stars by the Rebel Alliance. Think about that. Decades before the technology to build such weapons existed, they saw not just that the weapons would be created, but exactly when and how they would be destroyed. Such accuracy was almost incomprehensible, suggesting that Millennial's prophetic legacy had grown even stronger across generations. But even their greatest successes contained the seeds of tragedy. Supreme Prophet Kadan predicted that balance would be restored to the Force at the Battle of Endor. He told Palpatine this directly, warning his master of what was coming. Palpatine laughed at him. Then he grew enraged. The Emperor did not want to hear prophecies of his own defeat, even from seers he had elevated to positions of power and trust. That moment revealed the fundamental limitation of prophecy in a galaxy governed by ego and ambition. Even perfect foresight was useless. If those in power refused to listen, even absolute truth could be dismissed if it contradicted what the powerful wanted to believe. After Palpatine's fury at Kadan's prophecy, the prophets made a collective decision. They would not wait to face the Emperor's wrath. When his anger cooled and he decided they were more trouble than they were worth, they abandoned Dromund Kaas almost entirely, relocating to Bos Thurda, another hidden world where they established a new temple stronghold. They left behind the world that had sheltered them for over a millennium, the nexus that had amplified their powers, the ruins that Millennial had claimed as sanctuary. The eternal storms continued without them. The Dark Force temple stood empty once again, slowly being reclaimed by the swamp. History had come full circle. The ruins that Millennial had found abandoned, he had filled with life and purpose. Now his followers abandoned them in turn, fleeing the very system they had hoped to serve. And in that abandonment lay a truth that perhaps Millennial had understood from the beginning. Both paths were necessary. Both paths were flawed. The rule of two created devastating individual power, but eliminated redundancy and alternative perspectives. The Prophet's way preserved knowledge, but lacked the focused strength to act independently. Neither was complete without the other. Neither was entirely right or entirely wrong. Palpatine had proven that a Sith Lord following Bane's doctrine could conquer the galaxy, but he had also demonstrated that such concentrated power made the entire system vulnerable to a single point of failure. When he died at Endor, when Vader turned on him in that final moment, the Sith Order effectively ended. All that power, all that careful refinement across 1,000 years, eliminated in seconds because there was no backup plan, no alternative line, no redundancy. The prophets survived. They continued existing in the Imperial remnant after the Empire's fall, gaining significant power among the various warlords and pretenders who fought over the scraps. Their prophecies guided some, misled others, but always they endured. The knowledge they had preserved, the techniques they had refined, the wisdom they had accumulated across centuries, all of it survived even when the rule of two did not. Millennial had been both right and wrong. He had been right that concentrating all Sith power in just two individuals created fragility. He had been right that preserving knowledge across multiple practitioners had value. He had been right that prophecy and foresight deserved specialized focus rather than being subordinated to combat training. But he had also been wrong. Wrong to think his alternative path could achieve power comparable to the rule of two. wrong to believe that numbers alone provided meaningful insurance against catastrophe, wrong to assume that his teachings would remain pure and uncorrupted across generations. The truth, as it so often is, lay somewhere between the extremes. The galaxy needed both approaches. The dark side, vast and multifaceted as it was, could accommodate multiple interpretations of how best to channel its power. There was room for Bane's refinement and Millennial's preservation, room for the warrior and the prophet, room for the master who demanded absolute obedience and the teacher who encouraged independent thought. In the end, perhaps that was Millennial's greatest legacy. Not that he was right while Cognos was wrong, not that his path was superior to Bane's, but simply that he had proven alternatives could exist. That orthodoxy was not the only option, that heresy, properly executed, could survive and even thrive for over 1,000 years. The three-eyed mutant who had been rejected by his people, who had fled his master's wrath, who had hidden on a forgotten world and built something new from ancient philosophy, he had achieved something remarkable, not what he intended perhaps, not what he hoped for, certainly, but something genuine nonetheless. He had created a tradition that outlasted him. He had preserved knowledge that would have been lost. He had trained generations of seers whose visions, accurate or not, shaped events in ways both seen and unseen. He had proven that questioning authority was not automatically failure, that seeking alternatives was not automatically foolish, that sometimes the heretic becomes prophet and the exile becomes founder. And perhaps most importantly, he had demonstrated that success measured across millennia looks very different from success measured in lifetimes. His contemporaries would have judged him a failure, a coward who ran rather than fought, a heretic who abandoned the true path. But centuries later, when the rule of two had collapsed and the prophets endured, who could say with certainty that he had been wrong? The rain still falls on Drummond Kais. The storms still rage eternal. The Dark Force temple still stands in the swamp, empty now but enduring, as it has endured for thousands of years. Lightning still strikes the highest tower with rhythmic regularity, illuminating stones that remember when Millennial first claimed them. The planet waits, as it has always waited, for the next seeker who will find their way through the storm clouds and discover what secrets sleep in the darkness. The dark side nexus remains, saturating soil and stone, amplifying any Force user brave or desperate enough to tap into it. The knowledge has not died. The tradition has not ended. The prophecies continue, spoken in new voices on distant worlds by prophets whose lineage traces back to one three-eyed mutant who dared to ask if there might be another way. Some stories end with triumph, some end with tragedy. But the best stories, the ones that resonate across generations, end with understanding, with the recognition that life is complex, that choices have consequences we cannot foresee, that sometimes our failures are more instructive than our successes. Darth Millennial failed to replace the rule of two. He failed to create a Sith Order that could rival Bane's lineage in power or influence. He failed to achieve recognition in his own lifetime, or to see his teachings widely adopted. But he succeeded in ways more subtle and perhaps more important. He preserved, he taught, he created something that lasted. And in the endless cycle of galactic history, where empires rise and fall like tides, where certainties become questions and heresies become orthodoxies, simply lasting is perhaps the greatest achievement of all. So rest now. Let these thoughts settle gently into your mind, like that eternal rain settling onto ancient stones. Consider the long view, the patient perspective, the understanding that some seeds take centuries to grow. The storms of Drummond Kais sing their endless song. The Force moves through time in patterns too vast for any single eye to perceive, even a third one blessed with prophetic sight. And somewhere in that vastness, in that incomprehensible complexity, the story of every being who tried and failed and succeeded in ways they never expected continues unfolding. Let it unfold. Let yourself drift on those currents. The prophecies are written, the futures await, and sleep, peaceful and deep, welcomes you as the dark side welcomed Millennial to his temple so long ago. As always, thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden corners of Star Wars legends. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it helped you drift toward rest, I would be grateful for your subscription. And I truly do love reading your comments about where in the world you are and what time it is as you listen. Until next time, may the Force be with you, in all its light and shadow. Good night.